Hello guys, welcome to another video. This is going to be the beginning of a new video series I'm going to be making here on YouTube between now and patch 3.25, whenever that may be, and maybe even beyond depending on how this goes. The series is going to be all about interesting, unique items which aren't used very much, if at all. Discussing how these items can be utilised, looking at how they interact and synergize with other mechanics in the game, and hopefully inspiring some buildcraft with these unique items in the process. We're beginning the series with the shield, the Scales of Justice. This item was added in patch 3.14 as part of Ultimatum League's overhaul of old system rewards, and the Scales of Justice is an exclusive drop from the Labyrinth, as a rare reward from Izaro's treasure chests at the end of the Labyrinth, or the chests found behind silver doors. So let's take a look at the modifiers on this unique shield. Firstly, it's an intelligence base type, but it has the modifier has no energy shield. This is not the same as the one that appears on Dissolution of the Flesh, removes all energy shield, which sets your character's maximum energy shield to 0. The modifier on the Scales of Justice still allows your character to have energy shield, but it simply prevents the shield itself from granting the energy shield attached to the chiming spirit shield base type. We then have an added maximum life roll and added maximum mana roll, plus 40 to 70 for each stat, so quite a bit of variance possible there with the large roll ranges. Now for the special modifiers on this unique shield. 3 to 4 to 7 to 8 added fire damage per 100 of maximum life or maximum mana, whichever is lower, and unaffected by ignite or shock if maximum life and maximum mana are within 500. So these two modifiers combined incentivize stacking life and mana together in relatively equal amounts. The added fire damage that's gained from the shield is based on the lower of the two stats. So you want both your life and mana to be as high as possible, whilst also being within 500 of each other so that you benefit from the second modifier here too, which would then make you unaffected by both ignite and shock. Let's discuss that part of the shield first. Being unaffected by a debuff or an ailment is a powerful stat which is also quite rare. There's not many of these stats available in the game. Unaffected by ignite can be found on the Chieftain's Tesalio Cleansing Water Ascendancy Notable, which is one of the vital components of the currently popular Self-Ignite Chieftain build using the Fulcrum. This stat can also be found on Kahu Turoa's Certainty, a pair of unique boots which make you unaffected by all damaging ailments, that's bleeding, ignite and poison. Meanwhile, being unaffected by shock can be found on the Impulse's Broken Heart unique body armor, the replica Winter Heart unique amulet, and the Stormseeker unique gloves while you're leeching energy shield. Now, the terminology unaffected by is a commonly misunderstood stat, and this is because the mechanics of this stat function in a way which is different from the expected behaviour of how the stat is written. Let's say, for example, then, a character has the unaffected by shock stat. They get hit by lightning damage which has a chance to shock, and this hit would inflict a 20% shock. The expected outcome is that the 20% shock is inflicted on the character, but this shock doesn't apply its effects because the character is unaffected by shock. However, this isn't the outcome. Instead, what actually happens here is that the shock is inflicted on a character, but it has a magnitude of 0%. And that's because the functionality of being unaffected by something is calculated on the same layer as increases and reductions to the effectiveness of that debuff or ailment. But importantly, being unaffected by something is not the same as having 100% reduced effects on you, because calculations to increases and reductions include all modifiers to the relevant debuff or ailment on both the attacker's side and the defender's. For example, in Expedition you can explode a remnant which will make all of the monsters have 100% increased effect of shock. If you had 100% reduced effect of shock on you, and those monsters inflicted a shock on you, the resulting shock would be applied at normal magnitude, with no increases or reductions to its effectiveness, because the 100% increased effect of shock that the monster inflicts is additive with the 100% reduced effect of shock that you have on you, and these stats would then essentially cancel each other out. However, if you were unaffected by shock, the magnitude of the shock that the monsters inflict on you would always be 0%, no matter how much increased effect of shock those monsters had. Unaffected by is also different to immune to or chance to avoid. Being immune to something will remove any existing effects at the moment that you receive that immunity, and will prevent further applications while you maintain the immunity. whilst chance to avoid will prevent applications, but wouldn't remove any existing effects if they pre-existed before gaining the avoidance. So how can you make use of the Unaffected by Shock and Ignite modifier on the Scales of Justice? Well, aside from the obvious benefit of being able to ignore the impact of incoming shocks and ignites, there are some modifiers that you can take advantage of. Mokou's Embrace is a unique ring which will allow all of the damage that you take from hits to cause an ignite on you, whilst also giving you a 25% chance to be ignited. And in return, while you're ignited, you'll have 25 to 40% increased attack speed and 25 to 40% increased cast speed. And these stats can be further boosted by Speed Catalyst Quality 2. Mokou's Embrace is also a very common unique ring, so it's relatively easy to get a ring or two with good corrupted implicits, such as an increase to the effect of an aura. Just make sure you don't end up with this implicit. Mokou's is quite a strong item universally, whether you're doing a spell or attack build, but you could combine this ring with Wilma's Requital, a unique helmet which makes increases and reductions to cast speed applied to attack speed, meaning you could potentially gain close to 100% increased attack speed from each Mokou's Embrace ring in combination with this helmet. You would then need to find a way to utilise this combo since Wilma's also grants Ancestral Bond, so it would need to be a one-handed attack build if you're using the Scales of Justice, perhaps some kind of Totem Wander, but that's for you to decide. Meanwhile, to take advantage of being shocked, there's items such as Maligaro's Restraint, which grants increased damage and movement speed while shocked. But I think the more interesting thing with shock is some of the skill interactions that you can make use of with self-shock. You may remember the Build of the Week episode for ABC Kids' Self-Shock Lightning Conduit Raider. This build used Malakai's Loop to inflict a self-shock, which was then proliferated out to nearby enemies using a variant of the Vessel of Vinctar Flask. The build would then use Lightning Conduit to damage those enemies, a skill which deals a lot more damage based on the magnitude of shock on the enemy, before removing said shock. However, since the shock is being proliferated from the character, somewhat similar to an aura, the shock isn't removed and you can continue to freely cast Lightning Conduit at full effect while the self-shock runs its duration. That build used Replica Winterheart to solve the problem of having a big dangerous shock on the character most of the time, but the modifier on the Scales of Justice would function the same. You would of course need to find a new way to self-shock, as the shield slot would be taken by the Scales of Justice. There's also the Galvanic Field ability. When used, this spell grants a buff which increases your chance to shock, and upon shocking an enemy it will create a bubble-like area which will persist for a duration, continuously zapping enemies in the area. Now, it's actually possible to apply the Galvanic Field to your character, and the field will actually move with you, so you can make a auto-bomber style build with it. To do this, you need to self-shock while Galvanic Field's buff is active. There's plenty of ways to inflict a self-shock, but one of the easiest ways is to use the Storm Secret Ring, which deals a self-hit of lightning damage whenever Herald of Thunder hits an enemy, and conveniently it allows you to begin Herald of Thunder storms just by shocking an enemy instead of requiring you to kill a shocked enemy. You'll still need a source of chance to be shocked, such as a Replica Reckless Defense, or Self-Curse Conductivity. Now, Galvanic Field scales damage and area of effect based on the magnitude of the shock which caused the field to spawn, and that's where we have a bit of a problem. As mentioned earlier, being unaffected by shock will make that self-inflicted shock have a magnitude of 0%, so it will gain no bonus damage or area of effect scaling at all. However, as of last league, 3.23 Affliction, there's now a transfigured version of this ability, Galvanic Field of Intensity. This version of the skill zaps enemies at slower intervals, but it has over 3 times the base damage of the normal skill, and over 3 times the damage effectiveness as well. This means that you can use the self-shock method of applying Galvanic Field to yourself with the transfigured version of this skill without losing any potential damage scaling due to being unaffected by shock. Alright, what about the other special modifier on the Scales of Justice, the one which adds fire damage per 100 life or mana, whichever is lower? On a character with around 5000 life and 5000 mana, this modifier with a max roll would provide 200 to 400 added fire damage, which is roughly the equivalent of a level 25 added damage support. However, something to note is that the added damage is generic added damage, it's not specific to spells or attacks, which means it can of course be used with either, but perhaps more importantly than that, it can be used to boost the damage of mechanics that aren't affected by specific added damage modifiers, like the storms created by Herald of Thunder. The damage dealt by Herald of Thunderstorms isn't affected by modifiers to spell damage, so any added damage to spell stats specifically won't add damage to it, but the added fire damage from Scales of Justice will be added to those storms. Something else that's worth mentioning about this added damage modifier is that it's fire damage, not the usual lightning damage which is associated with scaling mana. And this chunk of added fire damage combined with the added lightning damage that you could be gaining from Arcane Cloak or Archmage support or even both, could provide an opportunity to make use of Trinity support if you're able to balance your damage output. Now, both the added fire damage modifier and the unaffected by shock and ignite modifier specifically state maximum life and maximum mana, and this means that both of those resources can be reserved without losing the benefits of those modifiers. You could theoretically reserve all of your life or mana or both, and you still gain the added damage equal to the lowest maximum of those two resources, and you'd still be unaffected by shock and ignite, assuming those resource maximums are within 500 of each other. This provides an interesting opportunity to use the Ivory Tower, scaling both life and mana and reserving most of your life to gain a large amount of energy shield, whilst keeping your mana pool intact to defend against chaos damage, and further scale damage with Archmage, Arcane Cloak, or even something like Mind of the Council. Do keep in mind that while Reservation still allows you to make full use of these modifiers, Conversion does not. For example, using the Ghost Wraith unique body armor to convert 50% of your life into energy shield. The Scales of Justice will then take into account your maximum life total post-conversion, likely significantly lowering your added damage and breaking the unaffected by shock and ignite modifier. If you don't reserve your mana pool, you will likely end up with a decent amount of mana and mana recovery, so you'll want to lean into that aspect of the build, making use of mechanics such as Mind Over Matter or even the Agnostic if you don't want to use Energy Shield. I'll link the Keystone highlight video below that I made for Mind Over Matter a while back if you're interested in that for more of the mechanics and synergies that you can use with that Keystone. So, why isn't the Scales of Justice unique shield used more often? Well, the most immediate reason is that the item is particularly niche in that it promotes stacking both life and mana simultaneously. Most mana stacking builds want to focus solely on stacking mana because they can make the most of using that resource. After all, the majority of the mechanics associated with mana, such as Archmage support or Arcane Cloak, become more and more valuable the more mana you're able to pile on. Meanwhile, for life stacking builds, they may even opt to ignore mana entirely using the Blood Magic Keystone because of the significant life boost they'll gain from the 10% more life multiplier. In the case of stacking either mana or life, it's simply more beneficial to fully focus on one of those resources rather than go for both. But because the Scales of Justice requires scaling both life and mana, it needs to compete with other options for the shield slot in that type of build, so naturally it's competing with items such as Wrathpit Globe, or even the newly reworked Mana Storm. To make good use of the Scales of Justice, a core part of the build would need to be using the Unaffected by Shock and Ignite modifier to open up potential use of niche mechanics so that the shield has an edge over other options. Or it would need to be able to scale life and mana in a way that's beneficial to the build in more ways than just the shield's added damage modifier alone. I'll end the video with a bit of a fun fact for the Scales of Justice. Back in Ultimatum League when this shield first released, it caught my eye and I actually tried to farm it from the lab. Ultimatum was my first league playing solo self-found hardcore, and I'd only started playing solo self-found the league prior to that one. But sadly, I had no luck looting it from the lab in that league. I had a fun idea for a build using this shield, which would use the Chieftain Ascendancy, gaining a bunch of added lightning damage from Archmage and Arcane Cloak, which I'd then convert to fire using Call of the Brotherhood rings, Cold to Fire support, and Avatar of Fire. The idea for the build was using the Agnostic for massive amounts of life recovery, because the Chieftain Ascendancy at the time had 50% increased life recovery rate on the Tassalia Ascendancy Notable, which improves the life recovery gained from the Agnostic Keystone without increasing the amount of mana that it drains. With that then, I'd only need to focus on scaling mana recovery, and I'd be able to put together a somewhat tanky character with Mind Over Matter, at least in the context of the game that we had back then. Alas, I didn't get around to making that build in 3.14 or 3.15, and by 3.16, Chieftain's life recovery rate modifier had been nerfed from 50% down to 20%, and I kind of lost interest in that idea at that point. I guess the moral of that story is to make the build when it's available to be made, because it might not be there to be played next league. Thank you as always to my patrons for your ongoing support of this channel. If you enjoy what I do here on YouTube, you can support me by becoming a patron. All of the information can be found by following the link to Patreon on screen or in the description below. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.